In the 1920s, John Dewey, American philosopher, started to plan in the University of Chicago a system of like a laboratory with kids that was called the lab school, which was a school to learn how kids were learning, with the idea that the school is basically the lab where you define how your society should be. And one of the things that John Dewey did was to use cooking as a tool for learning. When you do cooking, you transform motivation, you transform the practicity of what you are doing, but you also learn things on chemistry and physics, things on biology and numbers, things on history and art. And somehow what he was saying is learning should be not preparation for life, but it should be life itself. And school should be not designed as preparation for life, but it should be life itself. Now, the debate on change of education had been going on for the last 100 years. And actually, it's a debate between two models of what school should be. The transmissive one is conceived based on the idea that the school is the instrument to take the information accumulated during the history of humanity and been moved to the heads of the kids that are passive receivers of this information. And the alternative version is that knowledge is something that each one of us create. Because when we speak and when a teacher speaks, basically is giving information, but the knowledge is the use that you make with this information and how you connect all this information and the experiences that you yourself have to create properly knowledge. And then these two conceptions of schools have been the conception of the idea that knowledge is basically retentive by memory, contrasted with the idea that knowledge is a combination of facts, concepts, skills, attitudes, and values, and that each one of these things should be learned in a different way. You memorize an information, but you have to understand a concept. You have to practice a skill, and you have to live a value to be acquired as a proper knowledge. And also, the traditional school was conceived in a logic of selection. It means you use school to decide whether a person is valid or not, whether you are a 6 in maths or a 4, whether you are right for language or you are right for numbers. And the selection is if you are not right for either thing, you should be using your time for an alternative thing than just the academic career. And there is another idea, which is the idea that traditional school was designed based on the idea that the experience that you had there was conditioned by what you are going to get in the future. So it doesn't matter if you have a bad experience, if you are getting bored, if you don't see the meaning of what you are doing, because someday you are going to find why this is relevant. Now, people that 100 years ago were saying that this was wrong said that each one of the experiences that you have in school where you are a kid are going to be key to see what you are going to be when you are grown up. So basically, experiences matter. And if you get blocked with maths when you are 10, this experience is something that is going to be relevant when you are 30 and you go to a restaurant with your friends, and when you have to divide what you have to pay, you say, oh, sorry, I'm from literature. I don't know how to divide this for 4. No? So somehow the change between this concept of school as transmission and school as creating knowledge is something that goes to the very basics on the purpose. What is the purpose of education? What we're going to get from education? The practices of learning, which practices lead us to the proper knowledge, and to the point that is in the middle, which is how you assess that through this practice, you are going to get to that purpose. So in the 1970s and then in the 1990s, two big reports of UNESCO, the Vallory report and the Delors report, were focusing on how, which kind of competences people should have at the end of the 20th century. And they said, we don't want kids to be repositories of information. We want kids to be able to articulate the knowledge, to be able to have fulfilled lives, to be autonomous, and to live in society. And exactly the same happens with the knowledge on how people learn. In the early 2000s, the National Research Council of the United States published a big report on how people learn. In 2010, the OECD published a report on how people learn, explaining precisely elements that are the opposite of what most schools and many universities use as practices for learning. Look at this. It says, learners should be at the center instead of what we want to teach. Learning is a social practice and can happen alone. Emotions and motivations are an integral part of learning. Learners are different, with different previous knowledge and with different interests. Students need to be stretched, so effort is important, but not too much. No overloading, no monotony, no fear. It says assessment should be for learning and not of learning. So we should assess not the person, but how the process of learning happens. And finally, learning needs to be connected across disciplines. So no studying maths now, literature later on, and history separated. Now, although this had been going on for 2 or 3 decades, things probably haven't changed. So why is that way? And the question is that basically, the problem is that this change is a change of paradigm. It's not basically a change of practices. It's a change of what we understand that the process of learning in an educational institution is. And that means that the change of paradigm needs clarification, a new framework of purpose, practices, and tools of assessment, but also it needs a change of training of the people that are devoted to learning. If there is no updating on how society see the process of learning, what happens is first that there is no collaborative culture of learning, and therefore schools or university departments that are changing the way people learn work in an isolated way. So you cannot see what the other is doing, and the reference at the end is just the facts of your experience. So there is an isolated learning. The same that happened in a school where kids don't learn working together. If society confuses this necessity of disruptive update with innovation, what happens is that people don't want their kids to be part of experiment. You want your kids to be in a learning process that had been somehow proved. And finally, what happened also is that schools that had started 20, 30 years ago as innovative, with the time, they transform the practices that were innovative 30 years ago, therefore means, into an element of identity, therefore ends. And when you use means for an end, you could modify them. When you transform means in ends, you cannot modify easily the ends. So what happened is that many schools are just reproducing what they did 30 years ago because innovation is somehow punished as a way to modify what the school means. Now, there is a big change since this UNESCO report of 1996. And this big change is internet. Internet has an impact on the learning process similar of the invention of the print. We are just thinking on internet because it's so recent in the way that we think that our fathers thought on the invention of the television or the telephone or the radio. But internet transformed totally the context in two different ways. The first way is that the internet transformed the way we access to information and how we create knowledge. It transformed it because it could come from everywhere. And the second way is that the internet transformed the way we live, the way we work, the way we organize ourselves, the way we interact. And therefore, it impacts on the competencies that we need for life. In the last 15 years, we've lived a radical change in many areas, in such a speed that we don't realize what happened. Could you imagine which competencies is going to need a 5-year-old girl today in 15 years' time, if you think in artificial intelligence, 3D printers, big data, the Internet of Things, and all the process of technological exponential evolution. And this is why in the declaration of the World Education Forum last year in Korea for the next 15 years, it says, quality education fosters creativity and knowledge and ensures the acquisition of the foundational skills of literacy and numeracy, but also on analytical problem solving and other high-level cognitive, interpersonal, and social skills. So the contents of our schools are already obsolete. Now, how do we know this? Well, actually, the problem that we have is precisely that we don't know it, because we have the purpose change, and when you go to school, in their webpage or in the PowerPoint that they are going to show to the parents, talk about all these complex transversal skills, but then all the tools are focused basically on elements of memorization, short-term retention of information. So at the end, you don't know how to change your practices. And if the market asks you to change, what you are going to do is to be a consumer of new techniques of learning, even if you don't know why you are using them. So you change the chalk board for the digital board, and you are doing exactly the same. You change the pencil for the iPad, but you are using it for the same. How could we change this paradigm? How could we differentiate what is disruptive updating and innovation in education? Well, this is what we've been trying to do from a new initiative that we just launched 10 days ago called Escola Nova 21, New School of the 21st Century, which is an initiative trying to create an alliance for this disruptive update of the education system. This is promoted by several associations and a collective of schools, right now 26, that have already changed the paradigm of what school should be and what learning in school should be and which kind of experience kids should have in school. Something that is not only relevant for schooling, but also for universities. What do we want to do? We want to show that the change of paradigm is not only possible, but it could also happen in schools of very different typology. So it doesn't depend on the socioeconomic levels of the school. It doesn't depend on the socio-cultural profile of kids. It basically depends on changing the framework of what is the purpose of school, what are the practices that lead to this purpose, and which kind of assessment you use to get there. When you imagine which kind of competencies a kid today should have in 15 years' time, you realize that if the purpose is not modified, what it could happen is that innovation goes to the wrong way. If innovation is focused on making people get better grades into the exam for the entrance in the university, we are going to have people with better grades into the selectividad, but we are going to have people wasting their time organizing all the efforts on just jumping one piece of evaluation, instead of realizing that probably the systems of evaluation should be rethought. So precisely the difference between this disruptive upgrade and innovation is that the disruptive upgrade that all our education system needs is related with changing the purpose of education, with focusing the practices on the knowledge that we have on how people learn, and transforming the assessment in the assessment that leads us to the development of all the purposes that we have. And just this represents a radical change of all our education system. It means, for instance, that in our country, teachers of secondary education need more training than teachers of primary school, which need more training than teachers or educators for 0-3. Although it's been more than 20 years that we know that the development of the brain of kids in the 0-3 is the most complex learning process, and that needs people enormously prepared. So imagine that medical doctors that deal with kids are paid less and trained less than the ones that lead with old people. This would be unthinkable. Well, this is somehow what happened with our education system. And like this, many other things related on how the education system is organized. So the first thing that we need is this upgrade, this disruptive upgrade of the education system. And why we need this as the first step? Because the schools and all education institutions should be learning institutions, not institutions for the other to learn. Should be learning institutions because the two elements that are determinant for what schools are, which are the purpose and the practices, have every year new knowledge. We have to revise which purpose we need when the context changes, and we need to revise how people learn. And from this is where we have to enter with the innovation. We have to give new answers to give competencies for an environment of complexity and uncertainty. Thank you for your attention.